All right, hello everyone. Hello biology virtual students. So the assignment for tomorrow, which is Thursday, was to complete pages 1 through 5 on that unit packet. So I'm going to go ahead and go through those pages right now. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions regarding this unit packet. So I'm just going to review the responses that you should have for pages 1 through 5. And you will notice that this should correspond to your textbook for much of this assignment. All right, so starting with our flower model here. So on our first page of our packet, we have our flower model, or you can also call it like the atomic model right here. Kind of looks like an atom. If you haven't taken chemistry yet, which most of you haven't, you'll learn about that. So everything in the scientific method really revolves around questions. So that is the answer to number 1. The central theme of all scientific inquiry, as shown in Model 1, is questions. But you're going to notice that our scientific method here is more of a continuum. It's not a step-by-step list where you have to complete one thing before going on to the next thing. And we're going to talk about that going forwards. So what are the 9 activities that scientists engage in as a part of scientific inquiry? So there's a lot of different steps, and scientists will oftentimes do multiple steps perhaps at once. So they won't necessarily stop and think about, oh, I'm observing this flower is blooming perhaps. They might be formulating a hypothesis kind of while they're observing that and thinking about, okay, why is that? How might I explain that? So don't necessarily think of these as 9 separate steps. Think of them as all necessary activities to complete the scientific method. So these activities are observe, define the problem, form a study question, research the problem, state your hypothesis or what you would expect to find. We could also say that stating a hypothesis is like making a prediction for what will happen if we do a certain thing. They experiment and test a situation in order to gather data. They analyze results found in their experiments, and they reflect on their findings. And in reflecting, oftentimes, they think about whether or not these findings are what they would have predicted. So essentially, they either support their hypothesis or they reject their hypothesis. And notice all of these 9 activities are shown in the petals here of our flower, or in those ovals right there. Number 3, which of the activities would require a scientist to make some observations? So certainly observe is going to be the main one. Observe is going to be the key step in which they'd make observations, but they might perhaps make observations in other steps as well. Which of the steps would require a scientist to gather data? So there actually is a step called experiment and gather data. So that is the one that I chose there. They might be gathering data in other activities, like usually once you're analyzing results, you're done gathering data. You're just looking at your data. Perhaps you're gathering some preliminary data when you are making some observations. That could be as simple as writing down some qualitative observations or some characteristics, like the flower is blue, or perhaps maybe the older flowers are a bluish color, whereas the younger ones who are doing better and were watered more recently are purple. Those could be some data points. You might start to think about some of that qualitative data. Considering the activity described as communicating with the wider community, in what ways might a scientist communicate? So this is a great question. Scientists must communicate with not only their colleagues, but the general public. That is how we get accurate information about modern research. So some different ways that I thought about would be writing a peer-reviewed journal article. So a peer-reviewed journal article is essentially a journal article that has been reviewed by peers, as it is called. And peers would, as you would think about your peers as like your classmates, scientists would think about their peers as being other scientists in a similar field of study who know a thing or two about research in that study, and they are then able to critique others' research. So essentially, in order for science to be considered um, like renowned or well known or accepted, it needs to be peer reviewed, looked at by other scientists. They might talk amongst their colleagues, amongst those they work with at a university or at a different university. So there's many different ways they could communicate. They could communicate and correspond via email, actually talk, perhaps go to conferences and speak at conferences. There's a lot of different science conferences where maybe you have an ecologist or someone who studies ecosystems would talk about their research at, say, a given natural area, and then others might critique that research or ask them follow-up questions following their presentation. So many different ways. These are just a few. Remembering that scientists often work in teams, which activities would require a scientist to communicate with others? So certainly communicating with the wider community would be one of them that we just talked about, and also reflecting on findings. So when you're reflecting on findings, oftentimes you might reach out to another scientist in order to determine whether or not those findings seem consistent with other data. You might also do a little bit of follow-up research and see what else, who has found similar data, or perhaps somebody has a conflicting view of the phenomena that you're observing. All right, so key question number 7. Given your responses to questions 1 through 6, do you think these activities must be carried out in a specific order, or can multiple activities be carried out at the same time? So justify your response by giving examples. So your examples could be many different possibilities here. But what I said is the scientific method is a process, so no, it does not have to be carried out in a specific order. You could start with a question about a certain phenomena, or maybe your observation might lead you to a question, or maybe previous data in another experiment might lead you to a new question and to run a different experiment or formulate a new hypothesis. So there are many different jumping off points for this. All right. So this section corresponds to section 1.1 of our text. So in order to define the goal of science that would have been found in the text, the defined goal of science is to investigate and understand the natural world, to explain events in the natural world, and to use those explanations to make useful predictions and useful hypotheses. So I would also kind of add to that definition as the goal of science is to essentially use evidence to draw logical conclusions about the natural world. So we want to investigate it, and we want to be able to create some explanations based in logic. All right. So not based in opinion, but based in logic and evidence. Science is based on evidence. All right, so that is the goal of science. And science, as I stated, is really the organized way of using evidence to learn about the natural world. It also refers to the body of knowledge that scientists have built up so far to date after years of using this process. So science is an old process. It dates back at least 500 years, back to the Enlightenment period in Europe, when a lot of different scientific minds, like Francis Bacon, for example, he was a mathematician and a philosopher, started to kind of figure out that we need to write down our observations, we need to document our evidence in order to build strong claims and strong science, what it would later be called as science. So if we give an example of an observation, making sure that it's not an inference. And what that means is that we don't want to be kind of subjective. We don't want to make judgments in an observation. So if I see a boy walking down the street, I would just say the boy is walking down the street. I wouldn't jump to any conclusion like, the boy is walking down the street to go to school. That might, be a logical inference, but I can't determine that based on the information that I have. All I can use is my eyes to see exactly what's happening. So that is an observation. So my example is male birds are brightly colored, but female birds are not. So if I were to make an inference here, I might say, male birds are brightly colored due to essentially wanting to attract mates, which is a correct answer, is a correct explanation. But an observation alone does not factor in any of that judgment or evidence. It's just sheerly, what are you seeing? And a hypothesis is then a proposed scientific explanation for those observations. So what I just said, male birds being brightly colored to attract mates, that could be a hypothesis. So I could word a hypothesis as so, like if male birds are brightly colored, then it must be to attract mates. So that would be a valid hypothesis, and I could run an experiment based on that. So where are hypotheses, generated from? So they come from prior knowledge, they come from logical inference, and creative imagination. So I might have some background knowledge on birds, on their color patterns and how the behavior that they display during mating. I can use logic to determine that if males are competing, they must be essentially trying to one-up each other with their appearance, perhaps. And then I could also just have come up with that using my imagination. Like before there was any evidence that that was the case, somebody probably just thought, well, maybe that could be the reason. So hypotheses can be generated from all of these sources. Number 6, in science, a hypothesis is useful only if it can be tested. So hypotheses that cannot be tested or cannot be experimented on are not useful. So let's think of a good example of that. So if we had a hypothesis like essentially the sky must be blue because I like the color blue, that kind of factors in a personal preference and an opinion, but we can't really test. We can test why the sky is blue chemically, and it actually turns out to be due to scattering of nitrogen molecules in the atmosphere. But we can't test. We can't really test that phenomena as it relates to my own opinions. So there's many examples of that, a hypothesis that can't really be tested. There's some hypotheses that would just be too big, like maybe if it talked about the Earth and all of its complex climate systems together, we can use models to study that, but we can't ever kind of replicate all those complex systems in one experiment. So it makes it difficult to test. What are 2 ways hypotheses are tested? So by performing controlled experiments, or we can just gather more data. So sometimes we can't adequately perform an experiment yet, but maybe we can just keep on gathering data, and eventually we might discover a way that we can perform a controlled experiment. And kind of what we mean by a controlled experiment is that it has only one variable that is being changed. We control or keep many of the variables the same. So in our upcoming cricket lab, we're going to find out that one variable is making an impact on cricket chirp rate. So if there were a bunch of different variables, then we wouldn't be able to isolate what is the variable causing that change. All right, 8, good scientists are skeptics. What does this mean? So being skeptical about something means you're kind of leery to jump to any conclusion. You're reluctant to do so. And what that means is they question both existing ideas and new hypotheses. Even if they're, pretty sure or certain, they're gonna do their due diligence and try to run experiments on it anyways, just to double check. And they're gonna try to replicate other people's experiments to double check that that is indeed why this phenomena is happening, or in whatever thing they're studying. So look at figure 1.6 on page 7. So identify 3 ways in which science affects your life. So in that picture, they display somebody, and it's asking you to think about how science would impact your life like it impacted their life. So me personally, and you could have had a variety of answers for this one. So I'm a science teacher, so I like to spread scientific principles to my students. I practice the scientific method in order to test conditions that allow plants to thrive or not succeed in. So I might test the amount of water needed on a jade plant, and I would test based on observations and how the plant is doing. Is that too much water, not enough, or maybe how soil type is impacting it? And then based on the principles of science, I choose a healthy diet. So nutrition is one area of science that I reference daily as I make decisions to say eat an apple for lunch every day. All right, so moving on to section 1.2, that aligns with this part of your text. How scientists work. Sometimes controlled experiments are not possible. Why? So there could be multiple reasons why a controlled experiment could not be possible. Sometimes ethics might get in the way, or what's kind of morally right or judged correct by society can get in the way. So if there was an experiment, like, for example, the cloning of human beings, that has long been frowned upon and kind of kept from happening experimentally. So due to kind of moral reasons and perhaps even laws, perhaps even governmental laws, it might prevent an experiment like that from being run. So we need to think of ethics and what is morally right in science, because oftentimes, ethics and science can sometimes blur or get kind of blurred together, and it's difficult to always find, a balance of, discovering new information and making sure that we're doing what is right for the individuals involved. That is why there's many like ethical boards that you have to establish that you're doing safe practices before you would say use lab mice, for example, or mammals in your experiments. But sometimes ethics aren't the issue with the controlled experiment. Sometimes there's too many variables to account for how complex the system is, like the massive climate systems that make up Earth. So it's hard to create one singular model to essentially sum up the entire Earth, because it's a massive place. So what must researchers keep in mind when designing alternative investigations? And how do they do this? So they have to identify and think of as many relevant variables as possible. So they have to try to think of, okay, should I keep temperature the same? Should I keep humidity the same? Should I perhaps keep location the same? They have to keep as many of these variables the same as they can, but sometimes there's just too many of them to keep track of. So they've got to identify as many of them as possible. And ideally, what you want to do is use a large sample size in your subject population. So say I'm experimenting on, 10 lab mice. So some of those mice might essentially get sick from a certain drug. Say we're experimenting on them, but maybe some of them were sick to begin with. So we might be able to we might kind of discount that result because of chance. Maybe we just got a sick mouse or one that wasn't feeling so well. So if we have maybe thousands of mice that we're testing on, the odds of us getting kind of those irregularities in the data are much lower. So they have to pick, a large sample size. So small changes don't produce these misleading results in your data. And they do this through careful planning and rigorous thinking. So they have to plan out, okay, do I have enough supplies? Do I have enough mice? Have I gotten the right permits to do this experiment, for example? So it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of forward thinking. All right, what must happen for a hypothesis to become a theory? So it has to become well supported by much of our scientific community. All right. And it has to be tested many different times. So the experiment has to be replicated, like Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. That theory has been tested and replicated hundreds, if not thousands of times over the years. And they all yield a consistent conclusion. So if sometimes they're discovering something else, sometimes they're discovering what Darwin had found, then it wouldn't be a theory. It would be still a hypothesis. But it's a theory because it's widely supported and it's replicated time and time again to the same conclusion. Number 4, I have a theory why my computer is slow. Is the use of the word theory the same as how it is used in science? Explain. So this use of theory would kind of be defined in common language as a hunch or a wild guess, and that is not the definition of theory in science. So a theory in science is a widely supported explanation that unifies a bunch of observations and a bunch of hypotheses. So essentially, we might say instead, I have a theory that my computer is slow by citing some specific evidence due to the fact that I'm running out of hard drive space and my computer has low RAM or memory. So this is specific, it's testable by others, and if many have found the same conclusion, which is a tendency of why computers run slow because of a lack of RAM, perhaps, then you could consider it a theory because, this is widely known by the tech industry or the computer folks out there. So that you might be able to consider a theory, but certainly we don't want to just use it as like a opinionated wild guess. All right. So I'm going to make a separate video going over the experimental design practice just to split it up a bit. So if you only wanted to watch one or the other.